Okay, let's begin. Welcome to our first session in our mini-series, Risk-Based Financial Management and Supervision. Our topic today is ORSA, the core tool of risk-based supervision. For our attendees, please note that you may use the Q&A feature in Zoom if you have any questions during this presentation. We will address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. This session is also being recorded. You'll be able to find the recording and the slide deck on our event website later today. I would now like to introduce Fred Rowley.
Thanks, Christian, and good morning and good day to all of you who've signed on to this first seminar. My name is Fred Rowley, and I'm an actuary with a lot of life insurance experience. I've been an appointed actuary. I've done merger and acquisitions work. I've done demutualizations, and I've worked under a variety of supervisory frameworks and regulatory frameworks. So it's a great pleasure for myself and the main presenter, Alex Kunas, to be here with you today and to help you understand our view of how the supervisory mechanisms work best and how our tips for how you can use the tools to the best advantage. Alex is an experienced insurance actuary and manager, and in various assignments around the world. He's a South African, but he's worked in Europe, and during that time he was engaged to implement the own risk and solvency assessment processes and reports for a major European insurer. And more recently in South Africa, he's been, and around that region, he's been involved in a variety of projects, including due diligence arrangements and general consulting work. The thing I think I would draw out of our brief bios there is that both of us have been involved with companies whose solvency has become fragile at various times. Alex has worked in a custodianship arrangement, but where a company's affairs have had to be managed from outside. And I've worked in M&A situations in which we've considered how companies have come into distress and considered actually buying them and getting them out of distress. So I think we have relevant experience to offer here, and we're going to open our session by speaking about the ORSA, which is, as the title says, the core tool of risk-based supervision. So let me hand over without further ado. I'll be back later for one session, but for the moment, I'll hand over to Alex, and he'll take us into the introduction. And we aim at the start of this to find out a little bit more about you. So over to you, Alex. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate the introduction and greetings to everybody who's managed to sign on for this call. Firstly, just wishing you and your families a happy new year if you do celebrate the changing of the Western calendar year. And hopefully you guys are all keeping safe and your families are safe. I think many countries are under lockdown again. I know we, for one, are back down under lockdown. So I'm speaking to you from my house. The sun is up. It is morning here, but the sun is up. So good afternoon to those of you that are in more eastern locations to myself. So once again, thanks for attending. Ideally, we normally hold these sessions face-to-face and try and keep them fairly interactive. Obviously, given the current conditions, it's not as possible, but at least this sort of platform does allow us to reach a wider audience and also record it for future reference as well. As Chris mentioned, there is a Q&A section at the end, and we will address any questions you might have in that session. But if you have any questions during the presentation, please do raise those, type them either in the chat function or in the Q&A section of the Zoom functionality. If something does jump out to either Chris or Fred, if they're able to see those whilst you're typing, we might address those during the presentation, but otherwise we'll definitely look to address those towards the end. In terms of this first session, as you can see, that is addressing ORSA, which we're positioning as one of the core tool of risk-based supervision. We are aiming the session at a fairly high level, introductory level, but as Fred mentioned, we'll start off with a couple of questions just to better understand your backgrounds, and then perhaps we can tailor the session as we go and put a little bit more focus on the areas that you would like us to focus on. So we're going to start the session with a couple poll questions, 3 poll questions, just to better understand your backgrounds, and also give you the opportunity just to familiarize yourself and test the polling functionality within Zoom. So the first question that we have coming up there, are you an actuary or do you work in an actuarial field? So here I'm referring to specifically the actuarial functions, the technical functions. Maybe you've worked before in an actuarial capacity at an insurance company, or within your current role, most of you are regulators or in regulatory positions. If you're specifically working in the actuarial field, perhaps you can click on either yes or no there. Okay, so we have quite a high percentage, although this session is not intended to be very technical of nature, and hopefully you guys will still get value out of the more qualitative and the descriptive nature of what we will address. We're sitting at 61% that have worked in an actuarial field or are actuaries, and 39% that are not. Next question. Sorry, there's a slight delay when I control the slides, so apologies for that. Next question, have you worked on an ORSA process or report or the equivalent? I mentioned equivalent there because obviously some jurisdictions have a similar type of process, such as Australia, which goes by the name of ICAP, Internal Capital Adequacy Assessment Process. That's also common in the banking space, where many of you will have also had some experience. So we'd just like to understand what your level of familiarity is with an ORSA or ORSA, a similar ORSA process. Perhaps you've worked on an ORSA report within a company itself. Perhaps you can just answer that one, yes or no. Okay, so we're sitting at 59% that haven't. So I guess the sort of core background information that we will be presenting is really aimed at yourselves. And then for those of you that have, we'll look to focus a little bit more on the elements that really drive a good ORSA based on the observations that we've had, both ourselves personally and regulators that we deal with that have given feedback to the market from what they've experienced as a good quality ORSA process and reporting. Then last question, just to better understand what you're looking to get out of the session. We've got 5 options there. So just a point to mention, there will be some more polls later on in the session. The answers aren't all, there's not always a single answer that might fit best. So including this one, you might want to just pick the answer that you feel is the most relevant to yourself. So we've got some options here. Are you looking to gain a basic understanding of an ORSA? Are you more interested in the practical observations from ORSA implementations elsewhere around the world? Are you more interested in what a good ORSA looks like? So what really drives an effective ORSA process, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from a company perspective itself? And then I've given you another option there. Are you looking to gain the ability to predict the future or other, not mentioned above? So obviously I think we'll struggle a little bit on the ability to predict the future, but and we do have 2 participants that have opted for that one. Certainly, I think many of us would like to predict the future. I think you're probably going to be disappointed from the session then. I don't think we're going to deliver on that one, but at least I think one of the core principles of an ORSA does really put you in a position or a company or the regulator to better understand the realm of possibilities the future might hold and your ability or the insurer's ability to better withstand those future outcomes. So we've got over there, most of you look really interested in the practical observations. So we've tried to include an example just to drive what I've seen in the market and what Fred's seen in terms of where companies perhaps are a little light on understanding their business and really the core essence of what underpins an ORSA, and what can lead to failures or potential near misses in the insurance company itself or in the industry. So that's a good one that we'll look to focus on. We do have, as I mentioned, quite a number of observations that various regulators have shared with the market from when they have implemented something like an ORSA, particularly from the Solvency II world. The UK regulator and the Dutch regulator particularly shared quite a lot of observations of what they experienced, and then in my local market, the South African market, which has more recently introduced an ORSA, they've over the last 3 or 4 years been consistently sharing some of their observations of what made a good ORSA and what perhaps they were missing in the regulatory reports that they saw. And then lastly, as Fred mentioned on my introduction, I have been involved in formulating an ORSA approach at a large multinational, the global approach to an ORSA. But in addition to that, I've also been in the position where I've had the ability to drive the ORSA process within a smaller insurer, both or from an executive level. And I've definitely got some observations around having driven that process from a more bottom-up type of a level and to one where senior management and the board has really had overall control and drive of that process. So I thought it would be good to start off this session really with an example. So why do we need an ORSA? Is it just another regulatory requirement? What have we seen in practice? What lessons have we learned from both my personal perspective? I'm going to start off with an example. So what I've put up here is an example of a business plan. Now it's very, very simplistic, but this is an actual business plan that was shared with me by a shareholder, owner of an insurance company looking to expand their business and looking for advice from me on how to assist them in growing that business. What is key to point out that this was really being used to drive decision-making at a board level. It might be quite simplified from what you would see at a larger, more established insurer, but nonetheless relevant to just point out some of the observations and thinking that often goes on in an insurance company, particularly at a smaller insurer or a startup insurer when they're looking to enter the market. So you might start seeing this sort of level of analysis really at that startup level, the companies that are coming to you as a regulator to apply for a new license, that sort of thing. And when I look at a plan like this, there's a few things that really jump out to me. So perhaps you can take a look as well. And if you have any comments, please feed those through in the commentary. I'm just going to just take a look and describe really what stands out for me. Fred, if you've got any observations as well, please jump in as well. So I've just moved this on one slide and just removed a bunch of rows just to make it a little bit more visible. So when I look at this this business plan, and this was the entirety of what the board was making decisions, strategic decisions off of, I see a couple of observations. So what we mean here, we've got the months running down the left. So it's months looking forward into the future. Distribution hubs, the idea here was for the insurer to expand on its distribution centers. So these were physical retail outlets selling insurance policies to the public. As you can see, they were starting off with 10, and they wanted to grow that within 5 years to 124 retail outlets. They were predicting these figures in this column as new business per month per hub. And this led to a cumulative new business on these new retail outlets in this column. At a premium, I've just hidden the premium column, the average premium, and that then rolls up into this amount. and a cumulative portion, so that's per month, and then an expectation of claims. So they'd used a fairly crude historic backward-looking expectation of a claims or loss ratio of 40%, if I'm not mistaken. And then the shareholder was quite quick to point out, of course, the profit that he would be making. Obviously, that is the fundamental purpose, very key to him, and very keen to show, well, this world domination strategy is really going to roll up from a one-year profit, cumulative profit of 9 million units to over 246 million units within 5 years. Now, certainly very ambitious. I would love to own a business like this. I'm sure most of you would love to as well. And if your industry could flourish like this, I think all of you would be very happy as regulators as well, because certainly you've got a high degree of use of insurance products within your local market. But what stands out there? So what do we see? Firstly, extremely rapid growth. You've gone from writing 1,000 new business policies to 391,000 total within 5 years, very quick. Premium income, 85,000 per month to 41 million per month. Massive numbers cumulatively. Claims rolling up very quickly, also important. And of course, great, we're making a hell of a lot of profit. But surely, if you're going to follow this sort of approach, you're going to need quite a lot of capital outlay initially. So if we look a little bit deeper, what's missing here? So some of the straight basics, the first thing that slapped me in the face when I looked at this was, where are the expenses? This is not profit. If this is your expected claims and this is your cumulative premium, let's assume there's no reinsurance, that's certainly not profit. So that was quite obvious. In his joy and glee to expand the business and express this new strategy to the board, the shareholder had somehow managed to neglect the fact that he needs to actually pay some money in, or the business needs to pay some money in to actually achieve this growth strategy. So just on a month-to-month basis, obviously every company will have monthly expenses. But then if we look a little bit deeper, obviously there's a cost associated with all these distribution hubs. You need to physically go and source a property and pay for that property. You need to set it out. You need to employ staff to man that, sales staff to actually achieve these sales targets. Perhaps some, I see, but we've got a question coming through there. But as a regulator, do you think such kind of insurance with insignificant claims ratio does have value to policyholders? Definitely a good question. I'll address that quickly now. And certainly one that I've seen debated quite often. So I have previously served in a role within what would be termed in our local context as a micro insurance company. And there often you do see rather low claims ratios. And I would argue that just looking at the claims ratio alone is not necessarily a fair judgment or metric to judge the fairness of an insurance product. So specifically with micro insurance products, you've got fairly low sums assured, but you've also got fairly simplified products, and that also means simplified processes with often quite high level and light underwriting. So what that means is claims often are quite high, but also with the lower premiums and the lower sums assured, you've also got a high proportion of expenses. So if quite honestly, that business does cost quite a lot to administer. As in this example, there's the cost of physical stores here, there's the cost of all the sales staff. I guess you could argue if there's excessive commissions embedded in those premiums, which then lead to that low claims ratio. Fred, I see you've got a comment you want to throw in.
Yeah, and I think it is a good question, and I don't disagree with your response that it may well be that this is a very low premium, and therefore maybe the claims ratio will be low. But I think one of the other questions of what's missing from this chart is I'm not sure those claims are in fact all of the claims expense that we should be recording. We don't have evidence that says there's a change in the claims liability that's being accounted for here. And it's possible there are claims that are occurring during these risk periods that actually will be reported after the end of the period. And so that's another reason why this isn't profit, and maybe the claims are actually understated. But certainly it's been very prominent in Australia that claims ratios as low as this, or in fact even somewhat higher than this, are becoming unacceptable to the customer, and therefore will actually damage the franchise of the entity. I don't want to slow us down too much, but it's a really good question.
Certainly a valid point. And on the contra, and I do think still relevant to this specific discussion around it also, and what companies should be looking at, is I've seen examples in certain industries, often in the group business, the employee benefits, benefits that are offered to employee groups, where the premiums are actually too low, and structurally the claims ratios are over 100%. So certainly income protection or PHI type products, that's commonly been identified as an area where you see such things happening. So this sort of analysis should be conducted further there. That's probably more traditional actuarial, though, just on straight robustness of the pricing process. But having said that, okay, so coming back to this example, we see this is going to require capital to do this. So there's no analysis of what the existing capital position is. There's no analysis of whether they'll be able to support this, whether they even have the capital to pump into this additional line or distribution hubs, and what impact that has on the existing regulatory capital requirement, whatever that may be. There's marketing expenses. So the next thing that also, if I look a little deeper, how realistic is this? So often when you see these new business plans, often these startups, by very nature, the businessmen are going to be entrepreneurial of nature. And what you tend to see is they're very optimistic. So where they have quite a sales focus, these numbers can often, and I've seen this also with microinsurance applications within South Africa, now that we're issuing microinsurance licenses, a lot of these businessmen are very optimistic. You need to look a little wider. Can they actually achieve these sales targets? I mean, to just open up a branch and straight hit the ground running with massive new business targets, you're going to need to have a pretty strong brand, marketing and awareness, which all costs money again. So certainly there's that sort of thing missing, where they will actually source their capital. And then another interesting point is, so we mentioned these claims rising to quite high level. If you're spending a lot of your money, liquidity is often an issue and often comes to light as sources of failure in companies. So if you're spending a lot and you're only really going to start recouping that via premiums over time, you've got claims coming through, do they actually have the liquidity to pay these claims? So it's all good and well for the board to approve such a plan, but will they still be around via cash flow to actually realize this? And one last point on this slide that I just want to make is the risk element. So yes, it's great to grow really quickly as a company, and certainly in my previous role as a chief executive, that was always the goal. Everybody wants to see growth. Growth means, at least on a well-priced product, means additional profit, additional return on investment, but increased volume also translates into increased risk. So increased sums assured that might potentially need to be paid out. And certainly under a risk-based capital regime, that would require additional capital to support and provide a buffer. Fred also mentioned, are these actually going to be the expected claims? One last bit is, this is just a single scenario. It's a single best estimate, obviously ignoring expenses and some other obvious elements that should be in here. But what happens if claims do increase drastically? We're currently sitting in a pandemic scenario where certainly in South Africa, a lot of the life insurers have, and especially in the funeral insurance, where claims come through very quickly. So ignoring the IBNR, as Fred mentioned, but just straight claims have shot up as much as 180% of expected claims. What would have happened here? Would you even have passed month 5, 6, 7 if such a shock hits you? So really, there's quite a number of shortcomings here. So So that's just to give you a flavor of something that really we do see in practice, and probably just to highlight that need within the market to really understand risks within a company better, and often from the company itself and their board. I'm going to hand back over to Fred, and he's going to cover some of the causes of failure and near misses.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Perhaps you could flash up the two reports. And I think by way of introduction, what Alex was just describing is this situation of a management that seems unprepared to deal with the risks that they're taking on in their entity. And back in, I think it was 2002, the first of these reports, the Sharma report, was produced. You can see two pictures of the front covers of those reports. The Sharma report dealt with the causes of insurance failures and near misses up to 2002. And it actually contains within it a lot of the analyses of what went wrong, but it also contains a very exhaustive list of things that supervisors can do to help to avoid having them go wrong, and things to put them right, which they call, I think, the toolkit. I think they've got at least 4 toolkits in that report. It's well worth reading. The second of the reports, the blue cover, is from AOPA. That's quite recent, I think 2 or 3 years ago, dealing with the same topic. AOPA has a substantial database, I think, of 160 or so insurance events. Near misses are where the supervisor has intervened in the affairs of a company, and failures don't really need explaining. And they've also updated the experience for the events since 2002. What they tend to confirm the things that were found in the original Sharma report. I'll draw one particular point out of the Sharma report, which is that what Sharma found was that the financial reporting of these entities, since we all know is acting in arrears, that is, it only reports after the risks have happened or after the events have happened. And what tended to happen when a company was getting near the edge or getting towards a near miss is that the financial report didn't show the full extent of the problem, and it tended therefore to delay the reporting of the actual problems. The main conclusion of both reports is actually that the problems are not to do with financial reporting in general. They're to do with what happens in the financial conduct of the business, and they're caused by a lot of different issues. And here on the slide, you'll see the 5 major causes of failures, and there's a lot in common actually. Management, the top one for life insurance, is management and staff competency risk, which is self-explanatory, but I think it's obvious to supervisors that if the people in the insurers don't know their stuff, then the insurer is not going to have a sound future. Second, I think this is partly a reflection of the time, but second on life insurance was investment and asset liability management risk. And there is a huge tendency, and it's not restricted to Western Europe. There's a tendency for companies to issue guarantees that are backed by assets that are really quite volatile and sometimes not very liquid. And those things give rise to major problems. And the pattern repeats every few years when people forget that was what the problem was. They blame it on market risk generally. I'm not sure that market risk is very different from ALM risk in terms of its causing these events. Mainly the market risk is a problem when it acts in a way that goes against what's happening in the liabilities. Technical provisions, evaluation of the technical provisions, that is a problem. Clearly, they can be understated. Optimism, as Alex just mentioned, is a driver for that. And remember that many insurance managements are in fact given incentives to be optimistic. And therefore, the importance of integrity in the management and of proper remuneration and incentive structures is brought out by that point. And economic cycle and financial condition risk, I guess that's right, but everybody knows there's going to be economic cycles. And again, the question is not so much are we going to get an economic cycle, it's just the question for the company is whether when the cycle goes down, are they going to be able to survive it? I actually had to look up the definition on the non-life side of accounting risk. That's merely the selection of the wrong accounting policies or inadequate accounting policies so that they fail to report liabilities. So what you can see in that list of causes is, slides are flickering. Yeah, move on, please, Alex, that's fine. What you can see in that list of causes is that there is an interaction between external factors, technical factors on the next slide, and governance. So this lesson from Gabriel Bernardino, very highly respected chairman of AOPA, is the study of the failure shows that the primary causes of failure have been about poor management. You know, if you're not writing profitable business, then you're not going to stay solvent unless someone pours in capital into a loss-making entity. Inappropriate risk decisions, and more of those factors than about inadequate capitalization. And so management is just as important as risk in risk management. So very profound. I think the emphasis should be on management rather than just on the risk. So let's move that one along. So here's the interaction between the contextual issues, that's the economy, the things outside, the customer environment, the legal environment, competitive issues, technical issues inside sorry, it's gone again, but technical issues inside the company. So here's some illustration of the reasons, and these are drawn from those two reports. Excessive growth, chasing business, which causes causes strains on capital and on the resources, on the financial resources. And this is often done using product terms that are badly designed or, in fact, not fully understood. Investment guarantees have been given in all around the world, in fact, but in my experience in the UK, I've seen some very big issues around investment guarantees not supported by the actual earnings. And that's simply a failure of the management to understand what they're offering and what the consequences might be. And it's often driven by the environment, the competitive pressures. One of the things that tends to happen, particularly in developing economies, is that the limitations on investment options and opportunities tends to force money into investments that aren't perfectly suited to the liabilities, aren't ideal investments. And sometimes when the economy turns against you, then we can find ourselves with liquidity and valuation problems at the same time. Yes, next, that's it. Under reserving, as I say, under reserving tends to go hand in hand with underpricing. Under reserving tends to follow because usually, and particularly in short-term business, it tends to be assumed that the pricing was right and the reserve should be roughly the same, whereas actually in practice, that's not always true. If the market drives the pricing, then it may not be giving you enough money to fully reserve. Premium sufficiency needs to be taken into account, but it's not the only marker. And in fact, this point of high claims inflation is really valid particularly in the GI space, general insurance space, where claims can deteriorate simply through high rates of inflation. And of course, developed and developing economies can suffer from that from time to time. I've dealt with underpricing. I believe I'll pass through that quite quickly, but in particular, companies do under financial stress, and I'll repeat that, when they become under financial stress, they do tend to overvalue the assets. And it's quite interesting from an M&A perspective that if you go into a company that is struggling financially and is short of capital, you often find that some of the assets aren't actually worth what they're on the books for. And that actually means that the position is overstated. And concentration tends to happen as well, so that if you have 10% of the fund in one asset, it's a great difficulty. Reinsurance failure. Yes, that can happen, and in particular if there is a restricted range of reinsurers, and if the problems are global or at least right across the market. This can be particularly true of catastrophic losses. It's well known that cat losses are very hard to quantify accurately with any certainty. There's a huge uncertainty, in other words, in what the estimate might be. And if the market is concentrated, in particular, if your cat reinsurance is concentrated, that can bring its own problems. Corporate governance is a frequently arising issue, actually, that you might find, for instance, there's a dominant CEO, or that the CEO is dominated by one of the shareholders or his chairman or his or her chairman. And there might be a disconnect between, here it says the front office and the back office, but it might be also between, I suppose, the sales force and the finance area. There might be short-termism. It's quite common for management to be motivated by schemes that take account of the year's profit, the single year's profit. And so the incentive to report high profits is very high. And in order to fend off those things, you need not only the skill set, but also the integrity and the force of personality to actually resist the temptation to follow the incentives and to produce the right result. Corporate culture is important. If the CEO is not showing the right respect for the technical areas, or is actually emphasizing growth without really emphasizing profitability or long-term value growth, then there's a problem. The problems, of course, would be brought about, would be brought to light by the internal control systems if they're working properly, and that of course, if they're not working properly, that is another weakness that allows these things to happen without being detected. And I'll remember the last point. The last point was outsourcing. Some companies actually outsource things which are, one should rightly think are core skills, including IT or underwriting or claims management. And one particular form of that is when a reinsurer takes on 100% risk from the originating insurer, then the reinsurer is giving away control of that line of business, and that can be very dangerous. Just before I read this question out, which I will, I'll just go back to the two reports. The ORSA report has in it a list of, and I really would advise you to read it. It has in it a list of the causal factors and the early warnings that could have been derived. And it lists out all the early warning factors that might have impacted these situations. The top one is actually the deteriorating solvency. So what that's saying is that the solvency system does work and does tend to indicate what's going on in the company. But it's interesting that number 4 on that list, out of about 20, is the failure of companies to implement supervisory requirements. And number 8 on the list is the failure to provide information to the supervisor as required. And therefore, I think it's really important that those messages are remembered. But anyway, we can see all those potential causes for failure. We can see that they're to do with not so much with what's in the numbers, but what the management actions are. So what can you do as a supervisor to identify these issues early on and possibly prevent insurers from getting into serious financial distress? And of course, a large part of the answer is to do with the ORSA. And without further ado, I'll pass back to Alex. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that come from this part of the presentation. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, so obviously we've seen an example of a rather poor business plan, a lack of management information, perhaps some failures in the governance process. And then we've seen on a more wider and structural level, some of the experienced failures and shortcomings that have led to either failure of insurers or near misses, as highlighted by Fred and some of the common examples. So obviously as a regulator, as a supervisor, you ideally want obviously those, or to minimize those occurrences. And ideally, you want the companies to be proactively managing those risks themselves and identifying in advance where these risks might start arising, so that these failures are less prevalent. But obviously, companies are well placed to know their own business far better than any external party, far better than the regulator themselves. So the task itself for a regulator or supervisor is quite challenging, and therefore this kind of led to the introduction of a form of self-assessment in the form of something like an ORSA, where the company itself is able to assess itself given the knowledge of their own business. So what exactly is an ORSA? Now, I am conscious of the time moving on, and also in that third question, and second question, what your experience with ORSA and what you're looking to gain from this session. So I'm going to speed up a little bit over the more definitional parts of an ORSA. There are a range of sort of standard definitions of an ORSA that you can look up. Obviously, the various regulatory regimes that do have them. We've mentioned the Australian ICAP and the Solvency II ORSA. South Africa has an equivalent to the Solvency II ORSA, and in the American jurisdictions, there are a few jurisdictions there that have a similar type of exercise. So I won't go into that formal definition. Often they use quite high level English, but essentially what we're looking at is in an ORSA, it's a company's own view of the key risks and the level of capital. So what it ultimately constitutes is an assessment of those key risks and the capital adequacy, both current and prospective, so a forward-looking approach, and under both a baseline or anticipated, so that best estimate scenario that we saw in the example, but also including, quite importantly, under stressed conditions. I think fundamental to this, most definitely, it needs to be the company's own view. So that's going well beyond the regulatory capital requirements. Obviously, under various regulatory capital regimes, a risk-based capital regime, there might be a sort of standard formula approach, a standardized approach to measuring risks and the capital required, but that might not meet the specifics of a specific company who might have a different risk profile to the standard company. And therefore, you really need to the companies to understand their own specific risk profile and what and how that translates into a capital requirement. And also obviously beyond, say, for example, a rating agency requirement. And then obviously, or ideally, that risk or that ORSA process needs to be integrated. So it needs to be used within the business. So that's quite a critical point of an ORSA, and we'll come to the observations from regulators and from my own perspective, is where perhaps an ORSA is failing or not quite achieving the original regulatory objective, is where that ORSA is not really being used, where it's simply being produced as a report, where it's simply being used to satisfy a regulatory requirement. You're really not achieving much value, and then it really just is a cost. So it needs to be integrated within the key business processes. A lot of companies, they have a strategic process, a goal setting process, they have a budgeting process, they have a risk department measuring risks, or generally they have probably a capital management department. They've got an actuarial department probably looking at product development and marketing, etc. But really it needs to be tying these pieces together. So if we look at the more formal definitions of an ORSA, certainly it needs to tie these pieces together. I think quite critical to any definition of an ORSA is that it's not just a report. So certainly when that requirement first comes out by a regulator, often a company is so busy with a multitude of challenges they're facing, certainly now under a sort of pandemic COVID type scenario, you're just trying to keep the business going. You're just trying to somehow leverage value and optimize profits. So there is a tendency quite often when a new requirement comes to play that a company might just see that as, let's just get that done, produce the report, send it to the regulator, and off you go. But ideally, the true value of an ORSA can only really be realized when that also becomes an integral part of the strategic decision-making process. So this diagram just basically looks to basically highlight that it's a continuous process. The various pieces need to speak to each other within the enterprise risk management, so that ERM just stands for enterprise risk management process. And it is continuous, and it does need to have a constant feedback loop. In terms of the ORSA process itself, certainly not a static process and not a static outcome. It's ongoing, and it should be integral in just strategic decision making. Often and highlighted within the IAA has released a risk book, which is available on their website. And as Christian pointed out in the chat, we will make available a list of resources to you on the last slide, but it will also be on the website, which highlight these resources that we are referring to. But that risk book identifies 4 sort of key steps in the ORSA process. The first being the identification of key risks. So that's really just identifying the gross and net risk profile of the company. Gaining some sort of idea of which risks are more material, any new risks or emerging risks that might be hitting the company, and then assessing those risks under the next section there, the risk and capital adequacy assessments. That involves things like stress and scenario testing. Quite important here, and I'll go into it on the next slide, is that it should be qualitative as well as quantitative. So there's no point assessing things only quantitatively if you don't have a broad enough range of assessments. So if you've got a quantitative assessment to the 5th decimal place of a single baseline scenario or 1 or 2 scenarios, but you've neglected a whole bunch of quite possible risks, there's possibly less value. And quite importantly, that risk and capital adequacy assessment should really be on the company's own basis. So their view of the world, rather than a strict regulatory. As I said, it might not be applicable or suitably fit that company's risk profile. And then, of course, assessing where they can obtain capital should they need it. And then obviously there's a communication and a reporting aspect of that, both communicating to the board and the senior management of the company, as well as to the regulator, and possibly some form of releases to the market. And then quite importantly, that 4th step in the process is assessing the ORSA process itself. So it really shouldn't be static. The company develops over time, thinking develops over time. And so there does need to be generally at that 4th step where the company itself is reviewing the effectiveness of its own ORSA process. As mentioned, you certainly should be making use of both quantitative and qualitative. So we need to stress that. I think the big positive through qualitative techniques, so obviously we know about quantitative techniques. You get a stress test that gives you a nice idea of the range of possible outcomes under various stresses, a combination of stresses forming a scenario. It certainly gives you a nice tangible number to aim towards, and certainly one of the outcomes of the ORSA is for the company to decide on its own level of targeted capitalization. But where I think it's worth emphasizing the qualitative techniques is certainly just getting that breadth of thinking. It's easy to run a few stresses on the most common stresses or a couple of common scenarios, but really the sort of brain-breaking step here is to make sure that you've considered a wide and applicable variety of those situations. So some of the sort of techniques that you might consider, or an insurer should consider, and hopefully would come forward within an ORSA document in terms of qualitative techniques is simply interviewing the board, and regulators might look to do that as well, is interview the board or senior management and just ask them, what is keeping you awake at night? That'll often lead to further developing on those scenarios, etc., and better understanding where the risks within the business lie. The second one, which I think is actually quite useful, is something like a workshop of the risk function and business unit leaders. And I think here it's quite key to involve a wide variety of people. So Certainly something like a pandemic scenario. Many insurers had included a pandemic scenario in their ORSA reporting prior to COVID-19 coming around. But I think what stood out for me, and we'll see it in the observations section just now, is that a lot of these insurers hadn't really thought through the full impact of a pandemic scenario. Whereas if they had perhaps workshopped something like a pandemic scenario, and let's take, for example, maybe you include the HR executive or HR manager within that conversation, and you tell them, well, listen, we're discussing a pandemic here. So where people are infected by a dangerous disease and it's infectious. Straight away, the HR person is probably going to say, well, what about our staff? Our staff are going to be affected. Okay. Your head of operations is then going to say, well, obviously now we can't sit on top of each other. We need to move maybe to remote working. And then your head of IT will jump in and say, well, remote working is going to have operational costs, operational risks, cyber risks increased. And all of this we've seen now sort of manifesting out of the pandemic scenario, where the scenarios that I had seen on the pandemic level mostly were limited to just addressing the first order mortality, morbidity risks on an insurer's balance sheet, maybe a little bit on the market risk side, but really the operational risks pieces and the knock-on consequences to the economy, possible increases in retrenchment claims, and the overall increase in the expense basis were possibly less considered. So that's one that I think definitely is useful. Also useful in identifying perhaps two other additional dimensions of risk which are commonly ignored, which is how interconnected the risks are. So by involving a wider range of people, you tend to get more input on where the risks tend to knock on. And then the speed of which these risks might manifest. So if you're doing it in a straight risk department and they're formulating these scenarios in isolation, in reality, you're unable to get that breadth of thinking. Another possible technique is simply to look at similar companies and what risks they're exposed to. So this is a useful one for yourselves as regulators predominantly also to consider. You're in the unique position where you get to review what's happened to a variety of companies. And if you introduce something like an ORSA type reporting mechanism, certainly if I were in your shoes, I would be looking at similar companies and identifying risks that they've identified. And if one of the companies has not identified that risk, be posing that question to their management. Have you considered this risk? Is it applicable to you, and how will you act? And then another two techniques, obviously looking back at the company itself, they should be looking backwards to see how risks have manifested within their own organization, what are the ultimate drivers, what are the causes, what are the impacts. And then in terms of, obviously there's external specialists and technical studies such as the various global organizations, the World Economic Forum produces risk lists, etc., which can also spark ideas. So that's just the list there that I've just talked through. And so in summary, just coming back to close off on the more definitional aspect, it's an ongoing part, also is an ongoing part of risk and capital management process, certainly not a one-size-fits-all process. So that's particularly why I have steered away from including sort of a template of what you would want to see in your report. From my experience, as I said, I've designed an ORSA report from a globally active insurer's perspective, multiple entities, multiple countries, multiple products. That there's a whole lot of dimensions that needed to be considered. And likewise, I've designed an ORSA process and report for a small insurer, single line insurer, where it's proportionally a lot simpler. And certainly the content is slightly different, tailored. It should use both quantitative and qualitative analysis. If it's purely quantitative, I would certainly be questioning from a regulatory perspective is have they considered all the risks that are prevalent. And then obviously it needs to be integrated within the business. So as mentioned, if you're doing that bottom-up approach, you often see that it's a little bit disjointed. So I'm going to go back to some polling as mentioned, and this is just to close off the section. We'll just discuss a few questions around the ORSA. As mentioned, please just pick your preferred answer. Some of them you might feel are more than one relevant answer, and then we'll just quickly discuss these before we go into the regulator feedback from the first iterations within certain jurisdictions. So the first question we've got up here. Who owns the ORSA? So please take a pick there. We've got the option there, the CRO, the Chief Risk Officer, or the risk function, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer. Is it the actuarial team? Is it the board and senior management? Is it the CFO and the finance team, the Chief Financial Officer? Okay, so we've got some answers up there. So we've got largely split between two answers there, the CRO, Chief Risk Officer, and the risk function, and the other one being the board and senior management. So as mentioned, there can be more than one answer, but in principle here, I guess the point here is operationally, who's responsible for driving the ORSA. In all honesty, I've seen it pretty much all of these functions. I've seen it done from the risk function. I've seen it done by the chief executive. Certainly in smaller companies, that might be the case. I've seen the actuarial team drive it. I've seen the board and senior management drive it, but obviously operationally that would be senior management, not the board. And I've seen it lie within the finance team. So operationally, I would say, in my opinion, obviously there's more than one answer, is it doesn't really matter. It is quite common for it to lie within the risk function, so that would explain the 28% picking that answer. But ultimately, you need the balance of the use test, and to really drive that value within the ORSA, you need to see the board and senior management taking ownership. If it's going to be part of the strategic process, the board and senior management, you're going to get the most value out of it if they're heavily involved in driving that process. If we move on to the next question. How long should the ORSA projection period be? So within the ORSA, as mentioned, it's forward-looking, or it needs to include a forward-looking component. Should it be looking 1 year forward in terms of projecting the risk profile and the required capital position, 3 to 5 years? Should it be aligned to the business planning horizon, so whatever that period is? Or as long as plausible, so as long as you can get as far forward as you can get reliable results. So whichever one resonates the most with you, please could you click on that one. Okay, so we've got again a range of answers with the bulk saying aligned to the business planning horizon. So certainly that is generally the accepted definition. 3 to 5 years is often similar to that business planning horizon, and as long as plausible is also often aligned to that. So happy with those. 1 year is probably a little bit short. So generally what you'll see in the market is most insurers are doing 3 years. Originally, the thought was 3 to 5 years, but given the way the world changes and the business horizon changes over a 5-year period, a lot of insurers have said, well, we just don't see the value in a 5-year projection because the world's going to be different 5 years from now. So they limit that to 3 years, but really it should be aligned to their business planning horizon. If the strategy is set with sort of at a tangible level, a 5-year horizon, then it might be more useful to the insurer itself to run those scenarios, to look at the capital position and the risk profile on a 5-year period. Okay, next question. How long should an ORSA report be? So this was quite a contentious point in Europe when it first came out. I sat on the CRO forums working group on the ORSA, and it was interesting to listen to the discussions there. Should it be less than 10 pages? Should it be between 11 and 50 pages? more than 51 pages, or really it just doesn't matter. So we've got the answer up there. Again, a range of answers, some favoring the shorter, some favoring the longer, and some in between. And then the majority saying it just doesn't matter. So probably that's the one that I would most likely favor is, again, if it's going to make use, or if it is useful and it covers the main criteria, if it's useful to the board, if it's useful to the regulator to understand the business, it really doesn't matter. Realistically, I've seen they have tended to be in excess of 51 pages. I know those initial discussions within the European space, there were insurers that said, were adamant it needed to be less than 5 pages. And then there were others that were going into the 200-300 pages. Now, really, that depends on a couple of things. It depends on obviously how complex the business is and how much needs to be included, but really on the appetite of the board, whether they want to see details. So that that insurer that mentioned 5 pages, I think what they really meant was their board wanted to see a 5-page summary in order to make it useful. Realistically, their ORSA process would have needed to, and that was a big insurer, would have needed to just to meet the requirements of the Solvency II, also needed to rely on a bunch of frameworks and policies, etc. So I think there, what I would want to emphasize to any regulators looking at implementing something like an ORSA is don't be too prescriptive on how long the report should be. Obviously, it needs to be fit for purpose and meet your needs and the board's needs and look like it's being used. But I would encourage the allowance to cross-reference existing reports and policies, particularly the static items within the company's risk management framework and capital management framework. The next question, I think we've skipped one there, but I think given the time, that's probably fine. How many scenarios should an ORSA contain? 1 to 5, at least 5. It depends on the company and its risk profile, or as many as add value to management. So again, whichever one resonates the most with you. So interestingly, whilst I was in Europe, I was attending an industry function at one point, and one of the CFOs raised his hand and was moaning about the realm of legislation that was contained under Solvency II and how prescriptive it was. And he was going on for quite a while, and then towards the end of that session, we were discussing scenarios and the requirements of the ORSA, and he put his hand up and he said, well, the regulation doesn't tell me how many scenarios I need to run. How many must I run? And he was quite frustrated. And I found that a little ironic. So he was complaining at the beginning of the session about being too prescriptive from a regulatory perspective, and then later wanted guidance on exactly how many to run. And I think here you guys have nailed it as well. It really depends on the company and its risk profile, and probably the last answer as well, as many as add value to management. So it shouldn't be prescriptive as in you need to run 5 or you need to run 1 or etc. It really is about has the company identified a good range of plausible scenarios to understand their risk profile and what they will do should any of those scenarios manifest, or at least enough to be able to react to a variety of situations. The reality is the scenarios that do manifest will be slightly different to those that they've modeled. But if you've got a good breadth of scenarios, you will be able to understand the impact of certain aspects and be able to piece it together. Okay, so Anne says we're not behind. This is where we should be. We didn't miss any of the polls. Okay, so this question and it'll come back in our regulator feedback, is what is a reverse stress test? So I've given 4 possible definitions here. Again, which one resonates the most with you? A stress test formulated using a defined, usually negative outcome as a starting point. A stress test where the company stress tests the regulator, so the other way around. Or a stress test conducted moving backwards in time. Or a stress test designed to determine which combination of stresses will lead to a chosen definition of business failure. So this is an interesting one. As mentioned, it will come back in the regulator feedback. So you guys have opted for A and D. Generally, the other 2 were really just ridiculous answers. The moving backwards in time, possibly just an interpretation of what what I meant there. But effectively, A and D are both bits of a definition. So normally the reverse aspect of this is you're starting from a defined definition of business failure. Now, quite often in the ORSAs that I've seen, that definition of business failure has been a regulatory capital definition. So basically the company started from the point of where they failed to meet their regulatory capital requirement. What I would like to see, and what I've certainly used in my experience in the past, is broadening that definition a little bit. And certainly the Bank of England, when they initially ran these in banks, they had a slightly wider definition where business failure could be any business objective. And it would be good to sort of work backwards. And then the point is there to really understand what combination of stresses will lead to that failure. And then you can address those and put management actions in place as a company. But certainly reverse stress testing is one aspect that in the ORSAs that I've seen, and the regulators have also commented on it, where companies have struggled to formulate a decent reverse stress test. Next question, how often should an ORSA be run? We've got a range of options there. Whenever a company can spare the time and resources, whenever there is a material change in the company's risk profile, only when the regulator asks for one, only when there is a change in the business strategy, or once a year. So again, this one, there were a range of approaches, certainly when companies first get this requirement, from I'm going to run this every month to as seldom as possible, almost when the regulator dictates. But the main definition certainly of an ORSA always refers to a material change in the company's risk profile. So something like a pandemic like COVID-19 now is often triggered. Companies themselves should be running that themselves. A lot of regulators have asked the industry to produce a regulatory ORSA report. Certainly, this is an interesting one as well when you're running these, what you would often call out of cycle or ad hoc ORSA, is do you really need to run this full regulatory report? And certainly I would suggest from a management perspective, you wouldn't. You would be running the main components to identify the capital and risk impacts. There's quite a lot of answers for once a year. So generally that answer has been, or the definition given is, whenever there's a material change in the company's risk profile, at least once a year. So that's just to make sure that it is up to date. And then the last question before we move on, when should an ORSA be run during that period? So during that 1 year period, at what time within the year should the insurer look to run its ORSA process? So this was quite a debate when companies start designing their ORSA processes, and there was a lot of thinking, should it be within a certain period after the audited results are released? Should it be whenever the company decides to do it throughout that period, or at a date determined by the regulator that says maybe by 30 June, I want all results as at 30 June, or continuously throughout the period? So there, continuously throughout the period is a good answer. Within 3 months of audited results being released is an interesting one. So generally, and although I'd worded this rather loosely, whenever a company decides to, certainly that sounds a bit loose, but actually that's probably the one that should be. So as long as it's run at least within the minimum requirements from the regulator once a year, or when the material risk profile changes, as long as it adheres to that when there's a material change to the risk profile, it should actually be whenever the company decides to. Because then you're most likely going to get the use from the company. So ideally, when they're setting the strategy and testing that strategy, you would want these scenario results, etc. So that's often when it has been. It's been aligned to that business planning process, as you guys had identified earlier on one of the earlier slides, continuously throughout the period. Well, the process itself generally, because it's made up of generally good practice in risk management and capital management, it is running throughout the period. So it's also a good answer. Okay, so now that we've run through that, what really is a good ORSA? This is the sort of the last section. What have regulators identified that makes a good ORSA and a really effective ORSA? And some of these observations are also from my own experience of what I've seen as a good ORSA. And while I was looking into this, I came across an interesting article, which I've also given the source below there and will be in the resources list. It was a comment or an overarching principle from Joanna Kellerman, who's the former executive director of the DNB. She basically said, well, it comes down to three criteria, whether from her perspective and the DNB's perspective, and also could be deemed effective. And she broke that down into these three. So she said really the focus on the ownership level and the level of senior management involvement. So I'm just going to quickly read a quote from what she's got in that observation. So she said, first, the ORSA must be owned by senior management. There were cases where the ORSA was a bottom-up process without the necessary involvement of executives. This often resulted in a colorful collection of unrelated documents declared to be the ORSA. It lacked coherence or the ability to steer the business. And when performed this way, the ORSA is indeed nothing more than a dead letter serving only as a tick-the-box exercise. So certainly when the DNB gave their feedback on the initial ORSAs, it was interesting. They had a presentation from both the large insurers and presentations from some of the very small insurers, the funeral insurers in that market. And one of the presentations, interestingly enough, was from an executive at a funeral insurer. And it was interesting that the DNB had noted this submission as one of the most useful and insightful into the business, and the exec himself had highlighted how useful going through this process was to them. So if we go back to that example I started with, they were probably producing sort of business plans of that level and quality, and now all of a sudden they were forced to consider a whole range of additional content and ideas, which really led to a better understanding of their business themselves and a better formulation of their own strategy. So the second point that she mentioned, and I've touched on this a few times as well, is really the breadth of thinking and creative thinking. And this is really similar to that qualitative processes that I highlighted and techniques, is really there needs to be observable breadth of thinking and creative thinking in terms of the risks identified, both the emerging risks, the definitions of scenarios. If that is observable within the report, you can see this, by nature, there's going to be a more robust business plan. If they've considered a wider range of possible scenarios, if they've considered also the second order effects like the pandemic COVID-19 example that I gave. And lastly, transparency. So the assumptions and effects and management actions. If the regulator can, if you as a regulator can clearly identify why certain assumptions have been made, where the deviations to the standard formula are, how management actions are formulated, and whether there are actually workable solutions, and the thinking behind it, then really it helps both the regulator understand the position of the company itself, but also you're more likely going to have a more robust management team and strategy. So in the market observations from these regulators, as mentioned previously, this is predominantly from the South African, Dutch and UK regulators, but a few other points and then some of my own. I've tried to put them within these three broader categories, but really it doesn't matter. The main points that come through, and we've sort of touched on all of these within our presentation, but what they specifically have mentioned standing out is this holistic input and ownership. So if it's driven bottom up, you tend to just get a cross-reference of documents, which leads to and separate teams just supplying different points for the formal report, which leads to a contradiction in the messages. And that actually comes through quite clearly when you read it as a third party. If it's been put together in a siloed sort of project team, it often doesn't hang together. And that also means it's probably failed that use test. Whereas contradictorily or conversely, when the board or senior management is heavily involved in driving it, is using it as a tool within the business, you'll see a cohesive message throughout that report. Evidence of how the process was actually used in formulating strategies and management actions is a similar point to that. So often that was missing in regulatory submissions. So does it really look, so this was a comment that Fred added, does it really look as if they would actually do what it says within the report? And should those stresses occur? Will they do it with conviction, and will they be able to do it quickly enough? Proportionality and user friendliness, I've already gone through that point, but I think I would again like to stress that different insurers of different size, the true value really lies in the attempt. So I know some regulators will exempt smaller insurers from producing an ORSA, but certainly in some of the cases I've seen where companies have gone into trouble, those smaller insurers, they've been exempted from producing an ORSA. I think that company would have greatly taken value from producing an ORSA. In terms of breadth of thinking and creative thinking, so we've already gone through that, really considering the full realm of emerging risks and less quantifiable risks. These regulators saw that those were often weak areas where they hadn't been fully thought through, things like reputational risk, climate change, political risks, etc. Stress is not broad enough, not considering second order impacts. So that's something that comes through in their observations. Or identifying risks, but then not actually stressing them. So only having a base scenario. So it's all great to identify a risk, but if you haven't identified what the impact of that could be, even qualitatively, and what you would do under that, you've probably missed the boat. Reverse stress testing, we discussed that just now. It's often a shortcoming and least understood by insurers how to use that. And a lack of tangible management actions identified in scenario. As well as considering risks associated with rapid or high growth. So that comes from that example as well, that this was identified by one of the regulators. And then, as mentioned, transparency. Have you really been able to identify all the impacts and communicate those? So does the insurer actually understand their own business? Things like under groups, fungibility and transferability of capital. So can the capital really be realized and transferred at a specific value between jurisdictions? A level of contagion within a group is often poorly communicated. So if an entity elsewhere fails within a group, what level of contagion will that have? What effect will that have on the overall company or other entities? Or just not having enough detail of all the solar entities. Triggers, so we've got this out of cycle also. When will you actually perform it? What will you perform? That's often not well disclosed. And not really disclosing the actual assumptions used in the projection. So that obviously leads the regulators to query whether they really understand the results and the scenarios they're testing. What are the differences in focus between the ORSA and an ICAP? So we've just got a question there quickly, and I think we can handle it now. We've only got one slide left anyway before we go into questions. So I'll handle the last slide and then handle that question actually. Lastly, also just a lack of insight into how risk appetites, limits, and buffers are derived. So that leads the regulator to questioning, is this just an arbitrary number that's been thrown out here, or have they really considered how much risk they're willing to take on and how much capital they need? So in summary, a great quote, I think, from Joanne Kellerman again. In other words, a good ORSA enables an undertaking to enter into a dialogue about its future on the basis of its own views with any party that may be of importance. So really a useful document to discuss strategy, forward-looking, own views, and really used within the business. From my perspective, certainly it needs to coherently tie the company's own view of these three elements: the strategy, the risk, and the capital. Where you formulated a strategy, do you actually have enough capital to realize that strategy, and do you understand the changes in the risk profile that go with that? And have you identified workable management actions and a range of future scenarios to make you more robust? I've already addressed the proportionality. So looking at the time, I see we've got 10 minutes left. I think it would be good to go into these questions. As I said, there was just a question now from Adrian. What are the differences in focus between an ORSA and an ICAP? So please do type any questions you may have in the question and answer or in the chat box, and we'll address those. In terms of my experience and having looked at the requirements of the ORSA and the ICAP, they are very largely aligned. So there's some very slight text differences. I noted something like the ownership on the one is stated as the board and senior management, the other one says the board, but in reality, very much a similar exercise. Fred, I don't know if you've got any comments from an Australian perspective.
Yes, and I see Adrian, I think, is in New Zealand, so he may have seen some of this going on across the water. Firstly, I'm glad what you said, because I think I would have said the same thing. They're very closely aligned. In Australia, APRA has put the accountability more strongly and squarely with the board. In that, I think APRA sees the main responses to stress situations as being more something that calls upon the board to act in a way that's very much out of the routine. And I think they want to emphasize that if one of the remedies in your ICAP for a stress situation is to find more capital, then the board's going to be involved in doing that and may have to do so in a hurry. And it kind of brings it to the front of mind. And I think the other thing they'd like to see is the board being informed about the worst case scenarios or the stress scenarios that might evolve. So what they don't want to see is that information is stopping at the CEO level, so that the board don't see the clarity of it. But I think you'll find back in the days when ComFrame was being constructed and also was being thought about, that Australian thinking was in there based on what had already been done in Australia around financial condition reporting. And there's a great deal in common. Australia chose the ICAP name, I think, because we have an integrated banking supervisor, banking and insurance. We had to choose one or the other. So we chose the Basel II.
Yeah, so within the various jurisdictions, so certainly it's not just Solvency II Europe that has an ORSA by the name ORSA. There are various slight deviations or differences in definition. So probably that in this specific case, it's interchangeable. Do we have any other questions from any of the other participants? So hopefully, although we spent a fair bit of time discussing principles and the examples, I think those all related very much to the insurers' observations that they listed in the last set of slides. They were quite common, so the various feedback sessions or discussions I've had with regulators and my own observations is those were really the themes that teams tended to time and time again come through. There's definitely is a maturing of the process over time, especially if insurers are all of a sudden forced to produce something like this and they don't formally have it set up. They should have bits of the process. Yes?
Yeah, Alex, if I could just intervene, I've been typing answers to the questions on the Q&A line. So I'd just like to bring one up from Jessica Lee. I don't know what country she's in, but She's asked what are the key challenges in implementing ORSA, and I'd given her a short answer in the typing, but the summary of that would be that quite often the challenges are around the culture and the education of the people in the leadership roles. And it does take a good deal of time. It took a couple of years to embed the ORSA process in Australia. And part of the challenge was convincing people who really thought they knew already pretty well how to run an insurance company that actually there were things they needed to think about that were important to the prudential regulation of what was going on. And I think what I wanted to say was that one of the really important value adds in that is the production of workshops for board and senior execs to talk them through how they would respond to certain types of crises. And in my experience, there's no substitute for talking a board through a position which gradually deteriorates and in which at the end of the day, they have very few options as to what's going forward. And they begin to ask themselves, what could we have done earlier in this process to avoid getting to the position where we have no options left? And that's actually the whole purpose of the ORSA, is to make them think about the scenarios in advance. So I really found that a very helpful question. There's a few more I'm still typing at, and I'll leave you there.
Yeah, I see there's a couple open, so I'll try address as many of those 4 that are still open as possible. I see we've got one question. What is the cost, number of days of running an ORSA analysis for a small company if the company is not yet doing such capital planning and risk analysis? So again, it depends. I mean, it'll depend on the level of skill set within the company, and that ties to a couple of the other the other open questions. Within the small company that I was involved with, or one of them when in formulating ORSA, look, it's the time it takes to produce the relevant and what management deems as relevant projections, etc., to better understand the business. What I would prefer to see is just that an effort is made, even if it's just a qualitative. So one of the other open questions there is it an ORSA feasible for a third world country with still developing insurance market? And certainly if you're talking about complex modeling and quantification, it might not be within those companies. The larger multinationals that are operating those countries would probably be able to probably do more complex modeling. But the smaller companies, I would prefer, at least from my perspective, is to at least give a qualitative attempt. So basically you saw that example of the business plan that I'd seen. That's not robust, that's not strong enough. There needs to be scenarios, even if it's just qualitatively thought through. What will the company do if this scenario happens, that scenario happens? And then they can mature that over time. But really, just to make sure that we saw the sources of failure, often management incompetence. The value really is in the use. So if you're using it to drive your strategy, and using it to mature your own. So by nature, if you're running this and you're doing it at a qualitative level first, you're going to realize maybe I want to understand more quantitatively, and then mature that quantitative process over time. The last outstanding question there is, can a company outsource its ORSA, have a consultant conduct the process for them, or are they required to conduct it themselves? So certainly in developing the first runs of an ORSA, many companies will go outsourced. I do currently work for a consulting organization, so we would do that for companies, but really there still needs to be drive and ownership from that board and senior management. If I have seen, if it's done as a sort of side pocketed project and very much in isolation, then you're going to get a compliance exercise, a regulatory tick box. Yes, it will refer to existing documents, etc. It's a starting point, but really the use test, the use of that process will probably be failing. So until that's adequately communicated to the board and to the senior management, and they realize they should and can be using this to drive strategy, it's going to take a while. Last question there, how much quantitative information should an ORSA contain? I would compare this to an actual financial condition report where regulators would tend to read only the executive summary, despite them running potentially 300+ pages. Yeah, certainly. So there's often on those that are more mature, where there's more quantitative information, that the board and the regulator are probably only going to be interested in the outcomes. And then where they might question some of the outcomes, you might want to look a little deeper and say, well, what's gone on in terms of that calibration, the assumption setting, etc. But the reality is the useful piece, or the bit that's driving the decision, will be the outcome. It needs to be built on a robust process. So as I said, I would be in favor of cross-referencing to existing frameworks, etc. There will be valuations in the background, etc. And does that need to be in the report? Probably not. And it might cross-reference various existing reports and processes, and there the regulator can look at a hopefully shorter and the board's shorter summary, and then question through on those. And if they have some questions, then ask for that additional information. So certainly a 300+ page document, anybody's going to struggle to read, let's be honest. If it's more shorter and to the point, or at least if there's an executive summary up front that covers the points that the relevant reading party is interested in, that should suffice. But the content should be backed up by evidenceable calculations or methodology or thinking. I see we have
Thank you, Alex.
our 9:30 mark.
Yes, we've hit the mark. So I'll, Fred, do you want to do the closing?
I'll just unmute myself. Yes. Thanks, Christian. But above all, thanks to and thanks, Alex, for doing all the hard work in this session. Thanks to those of you who've sent in questions, and above all, thanks to all of you for being here present in this first of our mini series of seminars in relation to ORSA. The next one will be taking place in a week's time. I know some of you will have registered for that already, and then the third one will be a week after that. And I look forward to meeting some of you again in those sessions. We really do hope both the IAA and A2II, who are jointly presenting this mini series of seminars, really do hope you've enjoyed the session and got something out of listening to us that will enable you to take your jobs forward and be more successful in what you want to do in your daily lives as supervisors. Thanks very much for staying with us. I was really pleased so many of you stayed on right through to the end, and I look forward to meeting with you again the next time. Thanks again to Alex and the staff at the IAA, and to all of you. Bye for now.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.